Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. A transcript of today's podcast is posted on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts.
Hello, my name is Will Hayes, and I'm a principal engineer here at the Software Engineering Institute. I'm a member of the Agile in Government team. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Eliezer Canal and Eugene Leventhal, who are here to speak with us about blockchain. Gentlemen, if you wouldn't mind, introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about where you come from, what brought you to CMU and SEI. Ellie, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So, Ellie Canal. I joined the SEI actually a little bit back. I was doing data science first at PNC Bank, doing data analytics. I went from there to Highmark, health insurance company. I was working there also doing metrics and analytics, a lot of dashboarding. But I came to the SEI. We do a lot of, my team overall does data science, mostly for the cybersecurity applications we have here. So, analysis of malware binaries and help people do classification of that, analysis of insider threat data, help people find insider threats, and the like. But my recent work has kind of gotten me a bit more involved in this blockchain technology. And to that extent, here I am today, meeting all these new people at CMU who do all this fun work.
So there's a couple threads from your past we'll pull in a little bit, but let's have Eugene kick off.
Sure. So by way of background, I was working in the consulting space in financial services mainly before getting here. I had 7 years total experience between my undergrad and coming back to CMU for my graduate degree, where I'm currently a grad student now over at Heinz College on the public policy and management side. I specifically wanted to come to CMU because when I was sort of stepping away from the professional services world, I knew I wanted to go to an organization that was very active in the blockchain space. And when I started looking around, there was sort of a short list of universities. And I was very surprised that CMU wasn't on that list, but they had a very strong policy program. The policy program is sort of a data science light program as opposed to being just a pure theoretical policy program, and it kind of seemed the right avenue to, the right pit stop rather, along the avenue back to private industry, and before going into the entrepreneurship space, it seemed like the right both skill set and mindset to take on before kind of jumping back in there.
Great, and as I understand it from a little background research, you're trying to reach your arms across the university and really kind of bring some focus on blockchain. Can you talk a little bit about the startup and what you're working on there?
Sure. So when I came to CMU, it was actually pretty tough to figure out who was doing what in the space. Nicholas Kristen, who's probably been the most active and for the longest time from the professorial side, he's someone who I believe he released his first paper in the 2012-2013 time range. He's been looking at the space. I ended up taking his course in the spring. He was a great person to sort of build a network with and build a relationship with, but it was so difficult to find the other pockets of who was doing what across CMU. Ellie and I got introduced probably about a year ago at this point. And aside from maybe 2 or 3 other researchers, it was very tough trying to find who else was even in this space at all. And so around July of this year, I was put in touch with Mike Lasanti, who's the head of partnerships over at Scilab, and I was thrilled to hear that we now have an official CMU research initiative out of Scilab that is meant to do exactly what you just alluded to, which is centralize and coordinate. And I know centralizing a decentralized effort can be a little ironic, but nonetheless, at a campus, it needs to happen. So we're trying to centralize it, and we were very happy to discover that we have over 30 researchers who are doing this, not just a handful. And there are a bunch of private relationships with companies where we have people who are doing verification of private company algorithms and all these exciting projects that no one besides the researchers know about. So it seems connecting those folks and building out the student community was really the first thing that we wanted to do and really need to do in terms of having a more legitimate and more focused community here at CMU. And so now I'm working on a startup with someone else here in Pittsburgh called Distributed 49, and we're going, or our goal rather, is to sort of tie all the threads across Pittsburgh as a whole. So through the student activity side and with the research assistant job that I have over at Scilab, I'm doing this officially at the university, but we really want to expand that out to the city as a whole, find ways to collaborate with researchers outside of traditional academic settings, and also to bring in additional relationships beyond just executive education and the Scilab partners, which are sort of the 2 ways that we've been engaging in the past. So we're trying to expand that a bit.
We've had an interesting observation as this has gone through is that there's an enormous amount of interest from the student body in blockchain technology. I mean, it's really hot. You see this all over the news. You see it in a lot of startup funding that's coming through. You see it in the amount of venture capital that's going around. But that's reflected in the population that we have here. So Eugene, being a member of a startup, is very much in line with what we're seeing on campus. I'm teaching a course, I'm actually just starting that very shortly, on blockchain. Never taught the course before, but just because the title is blockchain, the wait list is double the size of the class.
Oh my, okay.
And the students are super excited about it. And it's not, there's certain topics where they're just trying to get involved because they see something and I can get a good job with it. They're legitimately interested in, what is this? Is it hype? Is it something behind it? Is it a niche product technology that's going to eventually have a real good use? And it's the conversation, and it's interesting to see that there's all the professors working on the little parts of it, but the students, they're just as interested as well.
So there's really a blossoming community, a blossoming set of topics that are really being rallied around this. So many people who've not heard of these more elaborate implications and applications might be thinking only in terms of cryptocurrency, that cryptocurrency defines what we're talking about. Interesting to hear your backgrounds too, where you come from. You have business and financial industry backgrounds. But if cryptocurrency turns out to be the digital tulip that some people say that it is, blockchain still survives because of all of these other things. There's a lot more to it, right?
Right. So blockchain has a strong relationship to digital currency because before Bitcoin, that was one of the primary use cases where blockchain technology, before it was even called blockchain technology, was being applied. There's a paper, I think it's 2002, but the original one was actually in 98, called Hashcash. Okay. And it wasn't exactly digital currency, but the fundamental idea was already being discussed there. There's a lot of push for currency because just it naturally flows. The concept of a blockchain, you're passing around money. People, you can imagine how it works. But put the digital currency aside, put all the ICOs aside, the underlying technology is a distributed ledger. Ledgers are present in many different types of business. There's supply chain, there's banking, forget the money, just the handling of the money. There's records keeping in all industries. So you have licenses of all sorts, you have health data of all sorts. There's a lot of areas where this sort of thing could come into play. Not to say there aren't challenges regarding to applying the technology, but it's really, there's a lot of places it can be applied. All that said, there's a lot of technical challenges, and then the question comes up, is blockchain actually better than the current existing solutions? And if it is, what are the costs? If it isn't, are there things that we can take and borrow from blockchain to either make the existing solutions better, or we can tack on these little bits and say we'll use blockchain in this particular small part of the application?
Okay. So as I understand it, the power of it comes from the massively distributed nature of it, from the fact that nothing is deleted, that you're not like my basement or my attic continually accumulating those empty boxes, but that there's really a sense of shared visibility. It's not unlike the open source community where sunlight is viewed to bring in higher integrity. Could you relate it in that way to open source? How does it grok that?
To a certain extent, because open source, when you have open source code, actually to give you an example, one of the biggest technologies that has enabled open source is source control, version control. So you have CVS, SVN, now we have Git. And when you look at what you have with these technologies, A, the code itself is public, and B, I can roll back to history. I can view history at any point, and I can say that one actually was the best one for me because at this point something else was introduced. I'm going to fork it. I'm going to keep my own version and allow either the main technology itself to roll off to some other direction or whatever, however I want to use it. I can look for small subsets and pull those out to my own code. Blockchain is actually very, very similar to that. I can look at history. Essentially, it's an enormous state machine. I can take the state of the system at any time and say, here's where I was interested, I want to find something there. As has happened a couple of times, I can go back to a previous state and essentially fork the entire chain from that previous state, as happened a couple of times due to different hacks that have occurred. So there's definitely a tie-in to that way of thinking. It's turned out to be an interesting application.
And some of the work that we've featured here before, your work on Obsidian, your interest in trying to add more capabilities to this community, that's something I think CMU and SEI are uniquely positioned to contribute to, and your efforts across campus and Scilab. Can you speak a little more about that? What are the frontiers you're encountering.
Sure, and actually I'd just like to add one more thing to the previous question. I also think it's indicative of a mentality that's becoming more and more prevalent in terms of we were very used to, up until the 60s, there was no alternative to either government or corporate run projects of these forms. So at the end of the day, it's still new that technology can sort of blossom outside of these environments. And I think from a historical concept, it's really important to consider that we're roughly at the 10-year anniversary point. I think next Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever Halloween is, I think it's technically the 10-year anniversary of the release of Bitcoin's white paper.
Wow.
So it's been 10 years since a mysterious entity released a white paper on a cryptography news list, right? It's very different than the runway between ARPANET and the other alternatives in the 60s through TCP/IP in the 80s and then browsers starting to actually be consumer-facing in the 90s. So in my opinion, and I know I am not a technological historian by any stretch, but this seems as though it's one of the first attempts to have a non-government or non-massive entity-sponsored technology take off. And so in the last 3-4 years, we've seen more governments, we've seen more enterprises put money into this space, but I think the initial growth of blockchain, similarly to the growth of open source and who are the kind of people to actually come home after a long day of work and contribute to the code online to never get repaid, it's this idea of there is a form of the world that we can achieve using cryptography and technology that is worth ideologically fighting for. And I think it's a small subset. I think the entire hype cycle and all the prices of last spring made a lot of people lose sight of that. But I'm actually really, well, not my bank account, but all the rest of me is very happy to see the current situation in the markets because it's kind of reminding people as to why you should care about blockchain. You're probably not going to become a millionaire by December. Like, let that go out the window. Why should you actually care about this tech? And for me, it was very much the idea of financial inclusion, especially for the 2.5 billion people who are unbanked, who don't have any access to physical credit markets, to physical banks, anything like that. This is a way to leapfrog that step. They don't need to play catch up with banking. They can jump to mobile-based, potentially cryptographically secured and potentially, cryptocurrency-based solutions that will be mobile. So that was what first got me into this topic, and I'm really excited to see where it goes.
One of the things which actually, which just made this such a fun relationship to grow with. So the way I first met Eugene was you reached out to me just to have a conversation, and we sat down in one of the coffee shops around here and proceeded to have almost a argument back and forth about whether this is something worthwhile or not.
Interesting.
And it's funny because even this conversation kind of harkens back to it. So I'll let Eugene right now play this is a huge proponent for social change. And you've actually given lectures on this concept. Blockchain is a democratizing technology. Fundamentally, it used to be that banking was a centralized concept.
Yeah.
Blockchain and Bitcoin specifically is democratized banking. There is no need for a central clearinghouse, which is a fascinating concept. But when you look at the actual ecosystem as it exists, that is the sole blockchain application that has really survived and thrived in the market. And you have this concept of Ethereum, which is now a public blockchain, and it's definitely been used as a trading platform mimicking Bitcoin, but the compute potential, the application of this as a distributed computer has really not picked up so strongly. There's a whole lot of economic reasons why, and it's interesting to get those discussions, but it's interesting to point out there's a huge amount of potential, and there's simultaneously been a reticence to pick it up. And it's interesting to figure out why and figure out then, well, how can we get past that? And if we can't get past that, what should we be doing with it instead? Because clearly something's here.
And going back to the last question I just posed, it's interesting for me to see that perspective a year ago when I just got to campus versus now, and at least my guess as to what the market cycle has played into that. Because I think when I just got here, there was so much more reticence towards it. Everyone that I talked to was sort of, why are you wasting my time with this blockchain thing? Like, even Nicholas Kristen, who is really deep in it, he was sort of, yeah, no, I understand and here are the proven ways, but he's still, I mean, as a good academic, is worried about the ways that aren't proven or thanks to what's going on in the market that might be greatly undermined. And I was just coming at it from the pure excitement of, well, yeah, but isn't it still cool in this application? Shouldn't you just be excited about that? And now, a year down the line, I feel as though that's totally reversed, because everyone who is just in it for the hype kind of scoffs at blockchain. I remember doing my recruiting events around campus, people would walk by the blockchain club and just keep going, and yet we had over 250 new people sign up, and we're one of the more popular clubs. So it's this funny give and take on that side. So I think now, and why I'm really excited about all these efforts and working with all the great researchers we have here is because applying more academic rigor while there's more investment coming in from the government, and especially from private enterprise, because I feel like there is a big disconnect between what private enterprise wants from a bottom line perspective, what's being sold to them, what's possible, and what's actually logical moving forward. And I think, going back to what Ellie was alluding to earlier, a lot of fancy private databases are being called blockchains when they're just more complicated private databases, and they're probably trying to make them be a blockchain will make them work more poorly, rather than just saying, let's just put in a distributed database and not go to this new fancy buzzword. And that's something that I would hope will diminish while we're seeing this kind of suppression in the markets. And I think, which is why now is the perfect time for more academics to get involved. The fact that we have 30 people at the cutting edge of either cryptography with thinking of two-factor authentication, you lose your private key, a way for you to actually get all your money back, that's a big one. People who are doing research on ledger manipulation, people who are looking into better programming languages, whether Obsidian or all their alternatives, different consensus mechanisms. So now we're starting to seriously think of all the little buckets that go into it. So now I think with the academic rigor across all of these topics, now we're getting to a point where the tech will advance, where we'll see, are there situations where we ever need a private blockchain? Will public blockchains just be a thing of the past, and we'll remember the 10 years where Bitcoin existed as a funny joke and we'll just move on? I don't know. So I think I'm just excited to see people who are a lot smarter than I am working on this in a research environment, not in one where they're immediately, if we don't make 10 million within the year, you know, we're going to get canned. And so yeah, I'm really excited to see this different environment give sort of the space for people to play.
So with an undercurrent, this tension between centralized and decentralized, the joke at the beginning, you're looking to centralize the focus on these decentralized distributed technologies. Yeah. If we think about going back to open source again, Git is now an offering through Microsoft. It is how government organizations are getting access to that key contributor to open source. Are there things like that that are happening in the blockchain world where some influential authorities' decisions are actually opening it up for a wider array of people? Probably the work you're doing and the teaching and research that you're doing. Can you comment on that?
So there's a fascinating, it's a phenomenon where you look at it and you say, this is a decentralized technology, but in order to apply it well, we have to centralize it, right? Mm-hmm. The concept of a bunch of researchers who are all doing something completely independently, we're going to put them in a building and have them call that building Carnegie Mellon University, is kind of an example of that. The fact that the technology is decentralized does not mean it will not benefit from centralization to a certain extent. So there's definitely a distinction to make between what the technology represents. You can almost think from a philosophical standpoint, depending on how you're trying to argue it. But then how do you apply it? How do you best apply it? One of the more popular blockchains out there right now, Hyperledger, it calls itself a blockchain, and there is blockchain technology underlying it. A huge amount of their architecture and their infrastructure in the whole solution goes towards centralization of the system. Without going into any detail, there's the blockchain aspects, but they specifically build in centralized components to ensure business flows smoothly. So you get some of the benefits of blockchain, but you'll be able to have certain amounts of guarantees about your system that you wouldn't necessarily get otherwise. And it's always this give and take. But this is kind of what Eugene was just saying. When you start to think about, you know, here's a fun technology, and we're going to now say, forget the fact that we're rushing for VC money. Let's focus on fundamentals. How should this be applied? Where are the problems with this technology? What are some questions that people should be asking, but they haven't had time because they're so busy being focused on making the quick buck? Now that hype has sort of started to die out, and we're getting significant research interest, we're getting some pretty interesting outcomes. The work that's going on right now on the mining, the proof of stake mining. So Bitcoin works by this thing called proof of work, where you're required to burn a whole bunch of computer electricity in order to have the system run. You're paying an electricity tax almost. There's this thing called proof of stake. How it works, don't worry. But fundamentally, it's a fascinating piece of technology, and I'll call it the people who are thinking about it and coming up with it have accomplished something really, really unique. It's a fascinating advance. Just to read about it, how can I get everyone to agree on something in a very constrained system? You're seeing some real advances here, and they're trying to push this forward and say, now we can make this be more broadly applicable, used in a better sense. And it's very cool to see.
So in some sense, we're hacking the notion that centralized, closed down, exclusionary equals safe. We're now kind of broadening it to understanding what safety and security is about with a completely different perspective. And
so one thing which I would take on that, it's interesting because when you look at the Bitcoin, the Bitcoin network. You look at the Bitcoin network, as you said before, you can't delete anything off of it. So that may be a huge benefit to someone who's pretending to perform an audit. But if for the person who had secret information somehow attached to a transaction in the Bitcoin network, and this has happened, that may not be such a great thing. And there's the whole GDPR, which just came out of Europe. That concept includes the right to be forgotten. Is blockchain fundamentally incompatible with this concept? If it is there any way we can re-include it? Is there a technology solution which you can apply to that? One of the lectures that I'm researching in this course that I'm giving is legal aspects of blockchain. And it's interesting because one of the earlier papers, right now it's all legal theory, there's actually very little applied. One of the earlier papers argues blockchain is essentially the most vulnerable way to structure any organization because everyone is maximally exposed from a risk perspective, and there's nothing put in place to make sure that they have any protections against fraud that occurs in the network. And we've seen this. I'm forgetting all the names of the companies where this happened. There was a company that had a huge hack, and so the way they responded to this hack, where they lost a huge amount of money, was they gave every single participant in the entire network a haircut. So all of a sudden, everyone lost 36% of their holding. That's not something you necessarily want to be involved in, or maybe it is, because you say that's the benefit, and in the long term, it'll be a more stable network. But it's interesting to see how something which would be a benefit in one case doesn't always play out so nicely elsewhere.
So there's some amount of what we heard as children. This will be on your permanent record, kid. And, watch what you're doing, right? So. And so adding caveats to your permanent record doesn't really take away the pain and the sting of what was there before.
Very much so. And in many situations where you have a record, currently, with paper-based or even computer-based, it is implicit in the system. There is a way to remove that record. If someone has a particular piece of medical history which they don't really want to have in their file, they can get rid of that. And it's up to them as a patient, or depending on who's in charge of the file system, to get rid of that. Under blockchain, there has to be a technology solution to enable that. And depending on how you implement a system, you may or may not be able to accommodate.
Interesting.
And I know certification is a use case that's come up, or the sort of the idea of proving that I've either accomplished certain knowledge or attained certain skills. But even so, a lot of those systems that are theoretically drawn out are predicated on the educational part being all automated and digitized. So there, it's much easier for it's for you to understand. Did I learn Python to a certain degree because you can review all my course studies and everything, but if it's, say, public speaking skills and it needs to be assessed by a human being at some point, then that's an inherent vulnerability in terms of proving the authenticity of the information that's there. What if you're the person transcribing my ability, you just accidentally confused us two, you thought he's great, I'm not, you put something wrong down, well, how does that get changed? Because in my record, all of a sudden it says I'm a great public speaker, and with something so innocuous, yeah, most public blockchains don't have a solution. The private chains that will offer opportunities for ways to do that, a lot of the time the more, let's say, the purists, especially the Bitcoin maximalist or whatever you want to call sort of the folks who have been ideologically in this since the beginning and are very much saying that Bitcoin still has its place in society, which is something that I do believe in, but they will look at any of those attempts and say, well, then you're just making a fancy database because you're stepping away from the immutability, which is the exciting part of a permissionless blockchain. And so it's just this never-ending back and forth of, well, that's great, but then how do you actually solve these problems? And they don't have an answer to that. So it's a bit frustrating, but I know ZK snarks is one area that I'm super excited to see, which for the listeners is sort of a form of cryptographic primitive where you can prove that something has happened without actually needing to prove that thing itself or show any identifying information. Just think of it as sort of a verifying algorithm on top of whatever you're doing. It's a horrible way of putting it, and I'm sure if the founders heard that, they'd yell at me. But nonetheless,
let's hope they reach out.
at a rudimentary basis of why you should care, I think that at least captures the gist of it. But that will be huge because that will be game-changing in terms of what information should or shouldn't be on a blockchain, because if you can truly anonymize it to a way where it's only encrypted information that gets up there in the first place, it's okay if no one can, say, decipher it, as long as someone can still prove that this, even though no one can read what's in this hash, we're verifying through this algorithm that we still have to trust at some point that it's doing its thing. But yeah, the matter of trust is always a tricky one.
So you keep pushing me back to thinking about open source.
Yeah.
What happens if we have malware out there on a very commonly used component that is all over GitHub? How do we remedy that issue?
See, we've had actually, this is the last one I remember. I'm sure this has happened since then, but there was a very well-publicized incident where a user deleted a particular library, let's call it, off of, this was NPM, the Node public library. And that particular library happened to be used in a web server, so that as soon as he deleted it, some 30% of node-powered websites just died immediately. And it's one of those, dude, not cool. And how do you fix this? I'll go even further. There's been a lot of discussion about using blockchain technology to propagate, I'm going to get this wrong again, the guys who are going to listen to this are going to yell at me, name servers, DNS system that underlies the entire internet. All we're doing is propagating records, and we're showing record updates. Use blockchain for that. There's been a lot of discussion about using blockchain technology underlying PKI. If I'm going to put out this public key, here's a great system for it. It's distributed by nature. The whole goal is to have this information get out there, make it this way, and I'll put out the revocation records the same way. But it all comes back. You're totally right. And this is the area where researchers, what you mentioned before, ZK snarks, that's CMU research. And now I'll just put a little poke our flag here, but there's a lot of cool research going on, and people are trying to figure this exact sort of thing out. How can I both have the benefits that I could gain and simultaneously enable technology or enable policy that requires me to not have something which is fundamental to the technology? There's no good answer yet.
Yeah, how would we enforce such a policy, right? I mean,
right. And there's no good answer yet. There really is no good answer. And it's part of what makes this such a fascinating field. One of the things which we're going to talk about in this lecture, the entire field of blockchain starts 10 years ago. And when I say starts 10 years ago, there were maybe 100 people who knew about it when it started. I mean, we're talking started. It got popular, 7 years ago, maybe 8, depending on how you're going to define popular, right? This is a nascent field. I mean, this is not something which we get to see every day. So you're watching this new technology kind of spread out. And unlike something like a tablet or an iPhone, where the same concept applies, but we're just seeing it grow. So I understand a phone. I understand a computer. I have a phone. That's a computer. Cool. I can marry that in my head. Blockchain does not have that similar model that most people can go to. For people who are programmers, I can point to Git and say it's kind of similar to Git with some caveats. Most folks don't know what Git is, and it requires a full paradigm shift in their head to say this is a computer that's simultaneously running on everyone's machine at once, and no one has to keep track of what it's up to because that's the whole magic behind it. And by the way, it doesn't forget anything. And it also knows who you are because of ID and PKI and all sorts of fun stuff. I've never heard of that before. And just explaining it and figuring out the new problems with it and figuring out how it fits in existing policy is a challenge.
And does this someday lead to what Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock enjoyed? They don't have to carry a wallet, right? So there are things that are so ubiquitous and so common, we don't need that hiding place that we keep in our hip pocket anymore.
And I mean, there's already places around the world where you don't really need to carry around a wallet anymore. I know folks in China, for the most part, there's so much of it is mobile-based, and through Alipay and through WeChat, you can cover so many transactions between friends, and sort of all of Venmo, plus buying regular things, plus hailing a rideshare with WhatsApp, all in one phone. Yeah, so I think there are definitely places across the world that are already showing us a little glimpse of that future. But kind of piggybacking off of what some of the things you were just saying, I get really excited also by the idea of distributed governance. Sort of if you have a truly decentralized network, where does the governance come from? Like, that is a whole new mess that we are starting to deal with on larger scales. And each time someone plays around with it, everyone from the outside, well, look at that mess. Why would we want that? But then if you think about, well, yeah, if you get a group of more than, say, 2 people together and you need to come to a decision consistently and things you don't necessarily agree with perfectly, it's not easy. And so the way of systematizing that, I think, is key, especially for some of the more open permissionless systems, and if they want to be as global as they claim to be. But I think at the very least it's forcing us to reconsider, how are we transacting things of value? What are the things of value that we're transacting in the first place? We're seeing a lot of them are digital, and in this environment where more of it can be automated, where you need less people touching it along the way, how can we sort of create forms of trust and agreement between that? And that's where it's such a difficult challenge. And I feel the first sign of a person not really getting the benefit of Bitcoin and consequently everything that's come since is when they just kind of gloss over it as if it's this inconsequential thing. Even if Bitcoin disappears tomorrow and proves to be totally wrong on every assumption, the Nakamoto consensus and the advancement it gave from a distributed consensus perspective is a big deal. No one's been able to achieve that. And, you know, Paxos Wrath, there are ones that tried to do it in different ways, but no one's done this in this truly open fashion. And even though it's still not the most efficient thing in the world by any stretch of the imagination, that still might have a role to play because, and even I forgot last week where I was having a discussion with someone and they were sort of asking me pretty confrontationally with, well, what's the point of Bitcoin? And in the context of the US, I was trying to explain, well, don't think of it here because all of the analogies fall apart. Think of it in a place where you don't trust your government, you don't have access to a bank, you do have a mobile cell phone, you do have cell phone and mobile technology, and all of a sudden a lot of these things started becoming a little more clear. So I think it's also important that entrepreneurs or anyone who's thinking about the space don't just think about the environment you're in if you are in the US or the West. Think of the areas that have the biggest problems in dealing with certain topics and try to think of how a tech like blockchain can help in that environment.
And jumping off that, because I think some of that's worth going into even a bit more, the concept of Byzantine fault tolerance, which is a term which no one knows really coming from reading New York Times every day, right? So what does that mean? What it means is I can have a bunch of people who can't talk to each other, and the environment in which they live is actively adversarial. People are trying to disrupt their communications, and they can still come to a consensus about a decision. That's an advance. That's not something that's trivial. How do I get all these people to come to an agreement about something when they can't even talk to each other easily? That's a huge advance. Fundamentally, it's a huge advance. You were talking before about ZK snarks. ZK snark is a way for me to prove something to you without you even knowing what I'm proving. There is some magic. Something happened in my hand, right? I don't know what it was, but I can prove to you that according to some rule set, this thing is true. Now, in the abstract, it's kind of hard to imagine what that means.
Schrodinger's cat pretty soon, right?
It is sort of, but let me give you a case what that means. That means I can say, you transacted with you. I don't know. In fact, I don't even know that it's you, and I don't know that it's you. I don't know how much money you had. I don't know what the nature of it was, but I know that it happened, and there's a public record that this happened. And now abstract it up. I know that 2 companies did business. I know that this person has a license, or a license was issued for something. The person will be able to claim it at some point using some form. But broadly, there is evidence that this happened. That concept is so foreign to us because we're so used to saying, show me the evidence. Right. Well, the evidence can now be given without anyone giving up privacy. That's a huge advance. It's such an advance that people listening right now are probably thinking, I don't even know what that means. But it's the fact is, this is now possible. I can prove that something happened without having to tell you anything about what happened.
So that can be kind of disquieting. For people who are accustomed to having a greater level of verifiability, understanding that something happened means understanding it.
Very much so.
But the way you guys talk about this, it's almost like this evolution is inevitable, that we will all be leaning into this before we know it.
Let's go the other way, right? It's now public on YouTube, and I encourage anyone listening to this to go check it out. It is almost trivial for me to make a fake video complete with audio of someone speaking. I can just put their face on top of an actor's face. I can mimic their voice using computer technique, and now they're speaking the words that I want them to speak using their image.
Yeah.
That did not happen, but it is right there. So the concept that we have historically of, Pixar, it didn't happen, so to speak, or show me, let me see it, that's gonna have to go. And we're only now seeing how important it is for that entire mindset to really start going out the window. As we move away from that, we're going to need some way to say, well, what is the proof then? What this doesn't give us a way to give the proof, but it definitely gives us tools that when we figure out what the proof is, I can convey it to you. And I can not only convey it to you in a way that you'll believe it, I can convey it to you in a way that you'll believe it, that I don't give up some privacy that I might have to do.
So that's a 180-degree turn from, unless it's been on social media, it didn't happen. If you don't see the picture of the great meal I had, I didn't enjoy it.
And it's definitely going to require an increased level of sophistication from people who are using it. And by sophistication, I mean they're going to have to understand, even though I don't know what all the math is behind this, I can appreciate this is now representing truth. The math gets a little bit hairy. I only know that because I tried to have one of the grad students explain it to me. And it's hairy. I'm not going to lie to you, but it's very cool. And the fact is, this is where we're going to see proofs in the concept of verified evidence, validated evidence going in the future.
And sorry, just to add one quick thing there. Stepping away from tech specifically, I think what both blockchain and other technologies are sort of forcing now, that to some degree is, in my opinion at least, a bit unprecedented, is the amount of personal change that's necessitated. Because we're no longer talking about being a user of something, we're envisioning products that fundamentally require humans with different values and behavioral programming, and we're just not there yet. And so the idea of sort of my own understanding of personal responsibility, that's something that has to evolve. The idea of managing and living through ambiguity, that's something that most people will pay as much money as they can to avoid ambiguity. Yeah. And we're moving towards a world of guaranteed ambiguity, guaranteed consistent digital threat of someone's trying to break through and hack us somewhere from somewhere. And in this environment, we still keep continuing, sort of buying into a lot of these convenience apps and things which make it seem as though, oh, you don't have to focus, you don't have to take on, because automation equals you do less. Well, no, automation means you can do some of the mindless things less. You can still be cognizant of them. It doesn't give you a carte blanche to not care anymore. You have to still be sort of the captain of your ship, so to speak. But that's one thing that I see as a huge bridge between tech and just humans, and that's one that I actually don't see anyone really trying to bridge, and that's why I wanted to come to policy school, actually, was to take a different approach than everyone else just doing what would have done in my shoes, which is MBA and then to a startup. So it's not as though I know the right answer. I don't think anyone has the right answer now. I think it's more of, it's a good thing that more people are complaining that this is a problem to begin with, which is already a good sign that at least people aren't alone in their thinking. But yeah, that's a much harder one. What are the behavioral economics necessary for technology to get the social change necessary for that tech to take off and work? Yeah, I don't know.
Wow. So this has really been a wide-ranging conversation. You've talked about the whole world. Let's talk about one really special place in that world, and that's Carnegie Mellon University, where we all live and work. What's going on here that we want to make sure we leave the viewers with?
Sure. So within the Software Engineering Institute, it's actually kind of funny. We don't have a huge amount of focus on blockchain historically. Where we're going now is two real aspects. The first is blockchain and security. I'm a member of CERT, cybersecurity. We want to make sure that the blockchain itself is a secure environment in which people can operate. Turns out that's difficult to do. So we've talked in the past about Obsidian, and we'll continue to talk more about it. But the briefest of explanations is, right now it's very hard to program if you're going to make a computer on the blockchain, it's really hard to program it in such a way that it's actually going to do what you want it to do. And it's very easy to screw it up. So we're making this blockchain technology where you can code on a blockchain and keep it secure, have a guarantee, or at least have some more guarantees that what you're coding will actually do what it's intended to do. The second area where we're getting pretty involved is just advising government. There's a huge amount, I don't want to say misinformation, but confusion. And as people are trying to learn more what is blockchain, and they see these different sporadic use cases come up, and 9 times out of 10 the use case is really not a great one, it gets very hard for people to understand what should I be doing with this, what's a good use case. So we're trying to play that role of just a trusted advisor and explain, you know, all this other stuff we've talked about before, notwithstanding, kind of here's where you're probably going to want to focus based on whatever your interest is. You know, if we're talking to this department or that department or this whatever, here's where you would be interested.
So a reasonable on-ramp, a reasonable set of choices to limit yourself to until you get much more capability.
About pilot studies and about, you know, what small area could we shoehorn this in. Also, a lot of talk about how do you integrate this with existing technology. Blockchain does not naturally fit into a software ecosystem as it exists nowadays. You know, we have the model of a database holding all the information. You don't want to just carte blanche go onto a blockchain because of what we're talking about permanence and about policy and requirements. But at the same time, you want to make sure that however you're using the blockchain, you're getting some benefit from it. You're not just putting junk data on there just because now you're using a blockchain. So figuring out that balance and that scope is a pretty big challenge.
So you don't just knock down firewalls and make it massively distributed. You transform the concept of firewalls to a different kind of trusted environment.
Sure. And again, blockchain is a technology for running things and storing things. But a lot of the traditional security aspects still apply. So, for example, if you're storing data, that means the data is there to be accessed, which means it can be accessed by someone who you don't want to have access it. And sure, you can have all sorts of cryptography, but you can have cryptography in traditional databases as well.
Right.
So a lot of the historical concepts around network security, secure architectures of entire systems, permissions and accessing, all that frequently still applies to a blockchain-based application as well.
Okay.
And I'll just quickly tack on to that. I remember I went to a DTCC conference back in 2016. It was my first sort of foray of getting more active into the space. And I remember hearing a senior banking technologist come out and say, look, we appreciate all of you brilliant coders out there who have never worked a day in finance in your lives, but you have to understand that we're not all getting rid of our tech stacks. Like, no matter how powerful blockchain is, we're not throwing away 50 plus years of financial investment. And you could just see the eyes of certain people in the audience open up of, we never thought about that. And it was funny, it was just slightly earlier days.
50 million lines of COBOL.
Yeah.
It's really not going away tomorrow. And however awesome your stack is, it's not 50 million lines of code.
Yeah, so I remember the big takeaway that day was on and off ramps, not replacement people, on and off ramps.
And Iron Mountain will continue to have paper stored.
Very much so.
Those are old habits, or are they good practices? What do you think, guys?
We're going to see.
Yeah,
We're going to see. We're going to see. I mean, as we move towards more and more digital and all the risks we were talking about before, you know, there's going to be a lot of paper.
Yeah, I just heard in regards to voting, there's a lot of jurisdictions that are bringing up the question, do we bring back paper ballots? How can we verify the votes in the first place? Yeah, purely for audit. So it's interesting how we might end up coming full circle to, oh, we're digital, just backed up by paper.
Exactly.
But yeah, and to tack on to what Ellie was saying in terms of some of the great things going on here, I also just want to mention that we've quickly become CMU has become one of the leaders from a class perspective. There are 4 classes that are fully dedicated to blockchain.
Okay.
2 of them are full semester classes taught out of the School of Computer Science, either by Nicholas Kristen or Vipul Goyal. Ellie mentioned that he's starting a class today. He's one of the half semester courses that we have going on, and the other half semester course is actually taught out of CMU Rwanda, which, if I'm not mistaken, was the first course at a university on the continent of Africa to teach a blockchain-related course.
Great.
Yes, that was Martin Sain out there who taught that. And here in Pittsburgh, we have another 6 classes that touch on blockchain, ranging from distributed systems to more of a network forensic analysis class, which, thank you for that introduction, Gabe, is fascinating, to more of the economics and financial markets perspective, which with fintech class and a financial crises class, and then some more pure technology ones, and all those range from a single class to a couple weeks being focused on. As we've been talking about, we have 30 plus researchers who, some of them, or most of them, are doing a good portion of their time dedicated to blockchain, ranging in topics from scalability to security to more of the usability side to some of the pure economics. We have some folks who are starting to look at it from more of the socioeconomic standpoint, which is very interesting. So yeah, I'm very excited to see the fact that we're not just driving it from a cryptography and computer science perspective. We have every school on campus pretty much, with the exception for now of CFA of the College of Fine Arts, for now. For now. Okay. We'll be putting on a blockchain play spring 2019. But yeah, we're getting a lot of students involved and seeing both on the undergrad, graduate, PhD. We have some professors coming out. So we're really kind of seeing across the gamut. And we're excited to try to get more group projects going. We've had a variety of startups come out. We've had Zilliqa from Singapore last week. We have Holochain coming through next week. We have AirSwap, which is a decentralized exchange later in the year. We have Republic Crypto. Hopefully I didn't mess that one up. It's either Crypto Republic or Republic Crypto. I always get it wrong. We have them coming out, sorry. And we have about 3 or 4 other companies that we're talking to. So on the club side, our goal very much is to sort of create a pipeline ranging from you just want to hear about it, or rather you have heard about this and you want to learn a little more, all the way through I am knowledgeable and I want to get a job in the industry. We want to be able to cater to folks across that full gamut, and that includes sort of pitch competitions, that includes general education, professor showcases, research showcases, student presentations, workshops, technical workshops as well. So we're really trying to make a very active community, and I think CMU should be in sort of up there with MIT and Stanford and Cornell Tech and a few of the other ones that have already claimed a name in this space because they've just been in it for so long. And I think CMU should be up there with those folks, and hopefully the work that we're doing through Scilab and through great folks like Ellie will get us there.
And it's worth mentioning, I mean, you're doing stuff with Pitt as well. I mean, this is a Pittsburgh effort, not just a CMU effort.
Yeah, so I know when Holochain is coming through next week, we're coordinating with the Pitt Club that's going on.
University of Pittsburgh, for those unfamiliar.
Thank you, yeah. And I'm going to be reaching out to Duquesne and Chatham, to the other major universities in the space, and we've been working with a professional developer group. So we're really trying to make this Pittsburgh-wide, not just our great little community in our little CMU bubble.
Eugene and Ellie, great. Thank you very much for all this neat stuff. And if you're seeing this, you have access to everything they've just mentioned because you are looking at something coming out of Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us. Links to resources mentioned in this podcast are available in our transcript. This podcast is available on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts and on Carnegie Mellon University's iTunes U site and the SEI's YouTube channel. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@sei.cmu.edu. Thank you.